Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
Hello, everybody. I'm Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist. This is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, relationships, professionals, experts, whoever's willing to come on the show. So today I have Dr. Randy Bell. I'm just thrilled to have him on. He is really a fascinating person, has a fascinating history. I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself because there's so much we could say, but you're a sociologist, you're an economist, and we're here to talk about your latest book, Post-Traumatic Thriving, which I love. I love that title. It's just all this post-traumatic growth theory and research that started in the 90s, and this totally fits in with that. So super excited to talk about this, and so excited and happy to have you on the show. Thank you for coming on.
Hey, Natasha, I've been looking forward to this. It's great to see you, and it's an honor to be invited.
Well, it's lovely. And I think you're joining us from California. I hope that June gloom is over, maybe not, but
we just broke through it.
Okay. Yeah, so let's just dive right in. Why don't we start off with just telling us a little bit about yourself? What is your story? What makes you interested in this topic? And what's your vast experience dealing with human catastrophe? Why isn't this called post-traumatic catastrophe? Why is it called post-traumatic thriving?
Well,
what have you learned?
Yeah, well, I to quickly introduce myself, I grew up in Fullerton, California, Orange County, and I now live in Laguna Beach part of the year, and Park City part of the year, and Vegas part of the year. So I kind of wander the West Coast like Bigfoot. I'm a socioeconomist, meaning that I study disasters and the economic effects that disasters have. And the cases I've worked on hundreds, but the World Trade Center, Flight 93, Hurricane Katrina, OJ, Jon Benet, Heaven's Gate, a long list. Anyway, I got interested in this topic because I would be working on, I was working on a case, the nuclear claims test sites on the Bikini Atoll, and I would meet people who had lost children, who had lost family, friends through these various disasters. And, you know, the court system doesn't award hugs or apologies, it awards dollars. So I compute those dollars. But Natasha, I found myself getting more interested in the people behind the statistics and studying the fact that some of the people were just ruined and train wrecked by the disaster. And I'm not here to judge. I probably would have done the same thing in the same situation. But some of them really kind of emerge triumphant, and they're doing incredibly interesting, thriving things. And I started really studying that, and I worked on the book for 15 years, researching those who have been through a trauma and then emerged bigger and better than ever before. And I did this really to give my clients and people I met in these disasters something more than a pat on the back and, you know, gee, I'm sorry. I wanted to give them a resource to maybe help them, give them a kind of a roadmap to do the same thing.
That's a long time, 15 years to be working on a project. And how does that, I mean, so tell me a little bit more about your upbringing, because I think we both come from the same kind of religious background. And I'm guessing throughout that 15 years, you've had your own, you know, things come up, your own traumas, your own, I mean, I just kind of know this personally that you went through kind of your own journey spiritually, et cetera. So
Yeah.
you comfortable sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I grew up Mormon, very active, went to seminary for 4 years, went on a mission to England. I went to BYU and I was an instructor, a teacher at the MTC, the Missionary Training Center, got married in the temple. I checked every box. I'm a box checker. And anyway, I was sitting at my kitchen table once, several years ago, and I came across on the internet. I loved the church and was always, researching what was new with the church, and came across the gospel topic essays I'd never heard of before. And long story short, came across the information that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And I had, of course, heard that, but I was always told that was an anti-Mormon lie. Found out, right there that the church is admitting it was true. And bottom line, we all know that Joseph Smith denied that his whole life. We all know it never came up in General Conference. The church has never published that in any official thing. There were kind of peripheral books about it, which I wasn't aware of. And anyway, I was out of the church in a second for the simple reason those are not my values. I'm just simply the wrong guy to lie to. And, so I'm not Mother Teresa, but I take integrity seriously. And so anyways, I started writing the book actually as a true believing Mormon, and I finished the book as, I converted to Christianity. I've always liked Jesus, but I've just dropped Joseph. And that's kind of where I am now.
Okay. Yeah. So that's really interesting. As I was reading through it, I could kind of pick out a few times when I was like, oh, I think this is speaking to our Mormon past and some of the things. Although, yeah, you don't really bring that into the book at all. But what I really like about this book, just to kind of set it up for the audience, it really hits kind of a personal perspective. It hits kind of a researching perspective and kind of your professional close-ups, right, with trauma. And you interweave stories of like a Holocaust survivor, I think a 17-year-old boy who gets sentenced for a murder. He didn't really commit himself. He was involved in it, but he didn't actually commit the murder. I think there's a woman who loses her home to a mudslide, a veteran medic, right? A surviving widow of a husband's suicide. So there's several stories, I think like about 10 of them that you interweave. And I just really loved how you organized the book. I thought it was very, very accessible. I've read a lot of mental health books, and sometimes I'm like, whoa, where's my PhD brain to kind of like understand these, good concepts, but just not as easily accessible. So I thought this was really accessible. Lots of great graphs, lots of kind of conceptualized ideas of how people can help themselves. I think trauma is a part of life. I think this is one of the things I want to talk about right from the beginning. I loved how you started with this idea that, if you're currently in trauma, you need to kind of address that. And so like, don't assume trauma's in the past. I think sometimes we think trauma only happens in childhood, or, when we talk about trauma, it's like this thing that, oh, wow, that really happened to you. That doesn't happen. It happens to everybody, right? And I think you shared a statistic where it's like 85% of folks can think of a traumatic event before they're the age of 18, right? So
yeah. By college age, what is it? 66 to 85% of college student age folks have experienced at least one trauma. It's going to hit us all. That's life.
Yeah, right. And I think we used to be much more picky about how we define trauma, right? It had to be your life was in danger, or you had witnessed somebody else's life be in danger. But now we're really using trauma to just think of emotional wounding, relational wounding, all kinds of things. And you do a good job too of describing kind of acute trauma versus chronic trauma, right? So like a one-time event that's traumatizing versus maybe you're in a relationship or a child who's in an abusive home, or where it's chronic trauma, CPTSD. So anyway, those are all really good things. But yeah, did you want to say anything about trauma triage? That's what you called it. Like if you're in trauma triage.
Yeah, I started the book off saying, hey, if you're in an abusive relationship or you're going through the trauma now, don't read this book. This is a book about dealing with past trauma. And I try to encourage the reader that if you're in that situation, get to a safe place, get away from whatever that situation is, because this book is how to heal from it. You can't heal from something that you're currently not addressing, and you've really got to, address it first.
Yeah, although I could see myself definitely, offering this book to people who are even in the trauma space, just to help them recognize. I think one thing you brought up is people don't always recognize they're in trauma.
That's so true. I mean, I didn't recognize some of the traumas that I had. I think maybe subconsciously I was addressing this topic and researching this topic because of traumas that I had been through. I hadn't addressed. I talk about my trauma. I was born with a congenital heart defect, and I had open heart surgery when I was 11. And I buried that issue, which is the classic mistake to make with trauma, is to not talk about it, not deal with it. And of course, my parents are from that era where uncomfortable topics are not discussed, and that kind of passive, a way of addressing things. So I had to come to terms with that and other traumas, and it was very healing for me. But I guess if somebody's in a trauma but they're aware of it, I guess maybe that's a gray area. Maybe you do want to read the book, but for the most part, you want to have addressed it, because this is about healing and kind of addressing the dive stage, readdressing those emotions, the get back on your feet, the survive mode, and then ultimately thriving, and kind of tapping into the fuel of the trauma to do something remarkable. Not everybody does that. Not everybody is capable of doing that or wants to do that. But for those who do, that's what this book is all about.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I guess the reason I want to just spend a little bit of time on this is because I think there's certain things that we can't necessarily quote unquote leave. Like, for example, BIPOC folks, right, with kind of systemic racism, or you've got LGBTQ plus folks, like right now we've got like over 700 current legislative things happening that's anti-trans, right? And so if you're a trans person in our country, it's very hard to just leave your trauma, right? Or to say, oh, I'm going to create a boundary with the United States government. They're going to listen to me and I'm going to have a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
So there's some traumas that are kind of systemically woven into our spaces, even our cultures, like you're talking about religion and people who maybe shift religion. There can be ongoing, trauma in regards to ostracization from family, things that are just very painful. So
yeah, good point.
I just want to put that out there. And I also, so you have a sentence in here that I loved. You said, unresolved trauma is the most significant problem facing humankind. That's a big statement, the most significant problem. It kind of goes along with my new mantra that I've been talking about for the last few years, which is sexual shame is a public health crisis, right? So my specialty is sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what you're talking about, kind of, if I was going to be specific. So tell me a little bit about that. Why would it be the most significant problem? How do you frame that in your thinking?
Yeah, I used to be of the mindset, which I think is really kind of obsolete, that, drug abuse and alcohol abuse and, incarceration and violent crime, those were the society's problems. I mean, my PhD is in sociology, essentially, in a single word. And then, you get into the trauma space, and I really kind of woke up to this because I started volunteering up at San Quentin Prison here in California, which is where California's death row is. It's a very serious place. And meeting with the inmates there and realizing that the crimes they committed were indeed hideous. Living in prison is no picnic, but then you hear their childhood stories, and it's just so heartbreaking that as little kids are eating out of trash cans and sleeping in the park, and they're watching their mom pimp their sister out for drugs. I mean, just absolutely horrific stories. And then the violent crime and the incarceration is more of a symptom of having grown up with that childhood trauma. And so I started investigating that concept, and sure enough, other PhDs much smarter than me have come to the same conclusion. So really, if you look at society's problems, there's unresolved trauma behind that. And the problem is, Natasha, and I know you know this, is that we don't talk about this stuff or teach it in our schools. That's why this topic is so important, because if you can, instead of disciplining the bully at school, why don't address the trauma that they're going through at home, because usually they are. You're getting to the real issue instead of just putting a Band-Aid on a symptom. And so, yeah, that's a big statement. I stand by it. And the more I, talk about the book and run around with these kinds of discussions, I'm convinced that is exactly right. That is society's number one problem. And that's why we got to teach our kids how to deal with their traumas productively and effectively. And then you don't have the fallout.
I love that. And you do a really good job throughout the book to talk about violence being a symptom of trauma, right? That's one of the ways that we adapt to the things that have happened to us. We can adapt by being like overly aggressive or under aggressive, right? Under functioning. And these are all adaptive features, but not necessarily, I mean, sometimes when we think about the word adaptive, how can that be adaptive? But it's adaptive in the form of self-care within yourself.
Yeah, I met Dr. Elizabeth Lombardo. I did the Today Show when I did another book, and she's the one that introduced me to a concept. It's in the book that you just touched on. People can address their trauma passively and bury it. That's what I did with mine. Aggressively, that's where you act out, commit a crime, incarceration, which by the way is on an industrialized scale in the United States, or passive aggressively, which frankly personifies Mormonism. That's my own personal view. A passive aggressive kind of behavior. But what Elizabeth came up with is, out of those three approaches, the fourth is the only healthy one, and that's to be assertive, meaning you respectfully assert your rights, but you don't do it aggressively, you do it assertively. And out of that mix, that's the healthy approach.
Yeah, I love her work as well. You talk about the languaging, which I think is really important, and how we sometimes struggle with the word victim, especially in trauma culture, that, everybody's like, I'm a survivor of abuse, not necessarily a victim. Don't be victimized. It's kind of, I almost think of it a little bit like American culture. It's like you can't just show your vulnerability, right? It's like you've got to be the strong person who survived everything. And although I think it's good to get to those points where you call yourself a survivor and even a thriver, as you're encouraging us to do in this book, there is a time and place to be a victim. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you think about that?
Yeah, going back to San Quentin prison, the group I join is a secular group that goes in and volunteers and works with not just the offenders in prison, but the victims. And it's a victim offender group. And sometimes, believe it or not, the victim and the offender will have meetings and they'll sit down together. And it's just the most, I don't know if spiritual is the right word, but it is the most emotional thing I've ever seen, to see somebody who, a young lady comes to mind whose dad was murdered by a drunk driver who deliberately ran him over, and sits down with the guy that committed the crime in prison and see, to some extent, a reconciliation. So yes, there's nothing shameful about being a victim and owning that. It may be not a term you want to hang on forever. It may be, but the point is that there's an appropriate place to be a victim. The other huge thing I learned out of San Quentin was shame and shaming, and what shame is all about. That's where you've done nothing wrong. But I felt ashamed of having heart surgery. I'd done nothing wrong. But if you do something wrong, that's guilt. You should feel bad that you hurt somebody or stole something or lied or something like that. So there's a very clear distinction between those two. And all these lessons came from people that were incarcerated. And I want to give them credit for teaching me.
Yeah, I love that. The distinction between guilt and shame, I think, is super important. I think since we're talking about shame so much currently, people like Brene Brown, Lisa Diamond, so many people are talking about shame not being good. But then I think some people think, well, isn't it appropriate for some people to feel bad? And you're right, it is appropriate at times for us to feel badly about our behavior, right? Or things that we've done. Shame is more about how you feel about yourself as an entity, right? That you
right.
are.
Who you are. Yeah, not what you did.
Exactly. So I love that. Okay. So you break up the book into kind of three parts: dive, survive, and thrive. And again, really well organized. The dive is kind of what people can expect to go through when they're dealing with trauma. Do you want to kind of tell me a little bit about?
Yeah, I've got to refer to it myself because it's, what I did, Natasha, if you think about it, you're a therapist, you know this. There's the 5 stages of grief. And that's essentially what the dive stage is. It's that I start off with shock, because understanding the brain's amygdala and the actual physiology is very, very helpful, because when you realize those rushes of dopamine or any number of cortisol, all those things, those are nature's response to save us from the lion that's chasing us in the jungle. These are evolutionary concepts, and understanding the shock, it's a natural, like I remember in Mormonism, when I came across the gospel topic essays, I was in utter shock. I couldn't believe the church was admitting this grandiose lie. And I literally shut my laptop down, rebooted my computer, and went back because I couldn't believe it. And that's another step, is denial, and then bargaining, trying to still make things work in spite of this glaring problem. So the dive stage are really the 5 stages of grief plus shock, to understand that these are normal processes. It's normal and to be depressed. It's normal to be angry. You just don't want to get stuck there.
Yeah, I really appreciated how in depth you went with each one of those stages of grief. I know I work with the stages of grief all the time, as far as helping people conceptualize what they've been through, conceptualize what they're feeling or have felt, and just normalize it. I think you do a really good job of just normalizing that. So I think that this, right off the bat, you're saying healing is not a solo exercise, right? So we can't heal on our own. We're social creatures. I tend to say we're pack animals, right? We're there's reptiles, right, that kind of lay their eggs and leave their eggs and go back out into the ocean. We need space to be comforted, grow, and be taken care of, and healing doesn't happen in a vacuum, which I think sometimes is confusing to people, especially in this cultural milieu where you hear a lot of kind of mental health pop culture say, well, you need to love yourself, you need to work on yourself, you need to do things by your, be able to validate yourself, and although there's truth in a lot of that self-work, we really can't do it in a vacuum. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, absolutely. Trauma recovery is not a solo exercise. That's where, when we keep it bottled up inside, we turn to alcohol abuse or drug abuse or any number of things. Pick your poison. That's why the number one pick is a good therapist. Sitting down with somebody like you who's trained, works miracles, and you see it over and over and over again. At a minimum, you should be journaling. You should be expressing it, at least admitting it to yourself through journaling. Going to a trusted friend can be a good idea, but you can be traumatizing them by sharing your trauma. And also, that friends may pop off with anecdotal advice that's not healthy. And on top of that, it may wreck a friendship, because trauma recovery is a big deal. So obviously, the number one pick, at least that I think, is a trained therapist, because, as you know, trained therapists know the steps, know what to say, know how far to go with the discussion, when to pull back. All these things are nuances that a trained therapist has, that your friend or journaling can't do. But at a minimum, start expressing it somehow, because bottling up inside always results in re-traumatizing ourselves.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think friends and family, obviously they're huge parts of our support network, and hopefully we all have 4 to 8 people in our lives that we can count on, right, to be there for us or with us. At the same time, even with really good intentions, people can give bad advice. People can have their own traumas they're trying to kind of resolve, and like you said, there is that weight that a loved one can't really, it's not fair to put that entire weight of your burden on somebody else either. That has to be carefully kind of managed. So yeah, I really appreciate your thoughts about that. And you talk about sitting in the fire, right? So I think a big part of what you're talking about throughout the book is facing our feelings. Like, so much of what we do when we're trying to deal with emotional issues is either we avoid them because it's hurtful, right? And like every nerve in our body is kind of wired to avoid pain. So why do I want to think about something painful? Why do I want to talk about something painful? Can't I just stick it under a rug, and just, if I don't think about it or come back to it, then I'll be fine, right? So What do you have to say about sitting in the fire instead of that?
Yeah. Well, I learned, I keep going back to San Quentin. First heard the term sitting in the fire, and the other term is grounding, what we can get to. But sitting in the fire feels like you're sitting in the fire because what you're doing is you're having these remarkably uncomfortable conversations. And the burn of the emotions is very real. You know, me talking for the first time about how I felt as a little boy going through open heart surgery, it brought all those emotions up. You know, as a guy in my 50s at the time, it burns and it's embarrassing and it's ugly. You know, we just had on our podcast Wes Geer on our podcast. He's the guitarist for the rock band Korn, and they're big. And he went through some trauma, and he said something remarkably important I want to repeat. He said, the quality of our success depends on the number of uncomfortable conversations we're willing to have. And that is so true, because we get in our comfort zone, and everything we have that, you know, we're comfortable with, to grow, we got to go out of our comfort zone, which means being uncomfortable. So sitting down with a therapist for the first time and talking about our garbage is no fun. But I learned it in San Quentin because these guys would go around and do these crime impact statements where they would tell in 3D color, vivid color, about the day of their crime, the time they woke up, getting dressed, going out, and what went down, and taking responsibility for the damage and the harm they caused to their victim, to their victim's family, to their own family, to themselves. And it's really ugly. And you just white knuckle it as people are talking about horrible crimes. And yet that is the process, because when you actually meet these guys in prison, you're thinking they are so calm, they are so gentle, their hospitality is so high, and they're so kind. Why are they here in prison? They just don't seem like that. It's part of the healing process is to own it and have those uncomfortable conversations and sit in the fire.
Yeah, right. Exactly. What do you think gets in the way from people being able to own it, you know, and take responsibility? I think that's hard. And you talk in the book about how people deflect or will justify, and all those are symptoms, right, of trauma as well.
Absolutely. Denial, deflection, all of that. It's uncomfortable. I mean, when I came across the Mormon thing, it's like, I didn't want to believe that. It blew up my whole world. It blew up my family relationships, my friendships, my community, the whole, I just sent 3 kids on missions. What do you do with that? And to find out, I wouldn't have done any of that had I just simply been told the truth. Particularly, I went on my mission to England, and over there, polygamy is still a really big deal, because the stories have gone down generationally through the families that, hey, the Mormons came along and they enticed our sister or our cousin to move to Nauvoo, and they promised there was no polygamy, and it was all a lie. Those stories are very real. And I was sitting there unknowingly lying, saying that never happened. No, Joseph Smith only had one wife, Emma. So I went through 2 years of that, and to find out, actually, they were telling the truth, and the Baptist minister down the street was telling the truth. It was my own church that was lying. It's utterly shocking.
Being lied to is a form of trauma. It's like gaslighting. It's like all of those things. And then you don't know what to trust, right? So I think, I mean, it's such a huge part of relationship success, right? Transparency. Which at the same time, I mean, there's got to be room for privacy, but privacy is different than dishonesty, right? In relationships. And it should still be communicated as far as how you're going to be relating, especially like in marriages and things like that.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah. When you say trauma competition, this is what I call it. Whenever I have a group, especially like female sexual trauma or religious trauma, people will come in and they're almost hesitant to attend the group. It's like, well, I'm here, but I don't know that my story is quite as bad as it should be for me to be here. right? Because there's so many horrible stories out there, and my story isn't that bad. So it's almost like people are disqualifying their trauma, right? And so you have a whole section here where it talks about your trauma is valid.
Yeah.
You share a little bit more thoughts about that.
Yeah, the way it works is that, and it's not a competition. Some people don't give credit for what they've been through and they downplay their own trauma, or the other way it works, and I'm sure you've seen this too, where someone says, well, this happened to me, and somebody says, oh, well, that's nothing, this happened to me, and it's worse. I mean, it's not a competition. And what might traumatize me might not traumatize you, and vice versa. So people just need to own their own story and accept that, let's go back to the basic definition of trauma. Trauma is anything that triggers us, where we relive that experience when we're triggered, when we hear that song, or that person's name comes up, or we drive by that building, where we get that flash of emotion, our heart rate is literally elevated, all our physiology is alerted, and in that high amped atmosphere, that the ultimate goal of trauma is to allow those triggers to come along and pass harmlessly through our brains, where our blood pressure does not go up. So one of the biggest lies you can be told is well, forgive and forget. Well, I mean, who's going to forget the loss of a child? Who's going to forget a rape? Who's going to forget any number of these things? That's just bizarre. You don't forget them, but the idea is to process the trauma so that the memory can pass harmlessly through our mind and not get us amped up and wanted to flip cars over in the parking lot, and angrier and depression and all the fallout, where that is not the response. So I think I've been on a little diatribe there, but but yeah, you don't want to get into a competition, because whatever is traumatizing us is that triggering response. And that's what we want to address. And it's different for different people.
Yeah. And you even talk about why is it different for other people? Like, I mean, what do we know about why people will have different reactions to the same event?
Yeah, that's a $1 million question, isn't it, Natasha? I mean, I don't know. I know people that had the same heart surgery I had that are just kind of, didn't bother them. But to me, it really did. And, there's, I don't want to dwell on, consume too much time with that, but to say, everybody's different. Everybody has different life experiences. Everybody has different DNA. There's a whole section in the book about DNA and the fact that, having different DNA, we're going to have different responses. It is what it is. It's just the point is that we got to recognize it and say, hey, this bothers me. This triggers me. I've got to process this. I need to sit down with a therapist and work this out. And then you can smooth sailing for the most part in the aftermath.
Yeah. You talk about it actually having, I mean, like genetics play a role. Temperament plays a role, personality, plays a role. And so there's so many things that we're such complex beings and we have different biology, we have different genetics, we have different kind of ways that we've been role modeled, just from our family systems. Mm-hmm. But yeah, of course, it makes perfect sense that we would have different reactions, to different things.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and just that shouldn't be a source of shame, right? Like, oh, well, why am I struggling, so-and-so more than this other person? But what were you going to say?
Well, yeah, the research that came out of UC Riverside on happiness and this question DNA, 50% of our level of happiness and our ability to work through things is DNA. And if we've got bad DNA, that there's nothing to be ashamed of there. We were born with it, just like when I was born with a congenital heart defect. I mean, it sucks. Okay, deal with it. And how do you deal with it? There's prescription drugs that can monitor that and even that out. And I've seen it work over and over again. So 50% is DNA. And then 40% are the activities that we choose. And that's the key. And then 10% is what happens to us. So only 10% of what happens to us is the result of the trauma. 50% is our DNA, which answers the question of why it affects, me and not you. And then 40% are activities. So I spent a lot of time in the book saying, hey, experiment. Maybe, meditation's a big one. Grounding exercise is a big one. Exercise or hobbies or all these activities we can do that are really very therapeutic. I mean, why is it that some brilliant, wealthy person goes out and does gardening where they could hire a gardener at a fraction of the price? Well, it's because it's therapeutic. They enjoy it. It's a hobby. So everybody needs to kind of experiment with different activities to find what resonates. For me, it's skiing. I love skiing and I love going to the beach and just looking at the waves. But some people go and look at the waves and after 5 waves, they're done, so everybody's got to figure their own thing out.
Right. We got to go skiing.
Let's go.
All right. So the second part of the book is kind of the survivor stage, right? So kind of getting back up. And the parts there that you talk about are confronting and sorting out and experimenting and acceptance, kind of some of the things that we've already been talking about. You give a great example of, I think it's Japanese tradition of kintsukuroi. Is it
Yeah.
Japanese? Yes. Can you tell us why you included that and what symbolism that has?
Yeah, I forget where that concept came to me. I actually have a dish over on my shelf over here. But in the Japanese culture, you have a beautiful ceramic dish, and someone drops it and it breaks. Well, at least in my Western brain, you scoop it up and throw it away and go buy a new one, I guess. Japanese culture is very different. They gather the piece together. They use gold to bond it together, and that pattern created by the cracks is considered a work of beauty. They don't take things that are broken and throw them away. They take them, piece them together, and appreciate the new beauty that's created. And it's just a really powerful metaphor for saying, you know what, if a person's broken, that is heartbreaking on its surface. But I've seen so many times, that's why I wrote a book about it, of people that have been through really horrific things. I mean, going into downtown LA and sitting down with a 100-year-old woman who went through the Holocaust, lost her family, and she was painting, her thing was painting these beautiful oil and watercolor paintings that are just fantastically beautiful. And she's so upbeat. And I would interview her. Why is it you are so radiant and so fun to hang out with when you went through the Holocaust? I mean, literally. And she would sit and explain that to me, and I would document that. I'm just fascinated by people that aren't thrown away or don't throw themselves away, that pick up the pieces and put it together better than before and appreciate the character that is built in their worldview.
Wow. Well, and this is a big part of kind of survivor chapter that you weave in, is the importance of self-worth, the importance of the stories we tell. And I think sometimes the stories we tell about trauma are kind of depressing. I know I was affected by that. I mean, I would say a victim, a survivor, and a thriver, of, let's say, sexual abuse.
Mhm.
And the stories I heard, both from the mental health community, right? Like all these symptoms that people of sexual abuse will probably, experience, which, I mean, that data is important. I'm not saying that data isn't important, but that's all I heard. And so then I saw myself through that lens of kind of brokenness. And then even in my church community, it was kind of like, damaged goods. And, I had sex before I was married, right? So I wasn't following the standards of the Mormon church. And then, so then the story was like, well, that must be because of my trauma. Like, I'm promiscuous, even though I was only having sex with like one person.
Right.
Not that there's anything wrong with having sex with more than one person, but I'm just saying these stories, right, that we tell about brokenness and trauma sometimes can be really internalized versus saying stories like, okay, yeah, shit happens. Life sucks. These things are really hard. I have a right to all these feelings. I have a right to the process of feeling my anger, feeling the grief, all those things. And I can still have a fabulous life. And, and I can have great sex, or I can have, great hobbies, or I can have, perspectives that don't sit in this broken narrative. Yes.
We couldn't agree more. And I mean, there's a whole thing there for me on the sex thing, particularly the LGBT community. Is one of my cases was the Pulse nightclub. in Orlando. It's a gay nightclub where a guy went in with a high power rifle, and it was absolutely atrocious. And I was a true believer at the time I got that case, and I've worked on many cases like this, and so I wasn't of any particular mindset walking in the door. But when I saw when I saw the amount of blood, and I saw the bullet holes, and then even more traumatic to me was the narratives and the stories I told, because I was given a play-by-play what happened where. And I walked out that door being pro-LGBT, affirming, saying, I don't understand a lot of stuff. I'm a straight guy, but I'm never going to contribute in any way to anybody's misery on their choices, sexually. It's not for me to judge. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm a friend to everybody, and I'll support anybody's right between consenting adults. If you harm a child, that's a different thing, because I'll be the first person to call the cops and report you. Don't, hands off the kids. But when it comes to consenting adults, that's where I had a big wake up moment personally for me.
Yeah, right. Especially coming from the religious background, right?
Yeah.
Set in the moment, right? You have a lot of fun little quips, right? Like, so you say we all need to get high.
Yes, we do.
So tell me what you mean by that.
Well, there's a guy who actually he was the head of he's the head medical doctor at Hoag Hospital, which is down here in Newport Beach, just down the street. And he came into our office and he filmed some videos, but I got to give him credit. He's the one that came up with it. But basically, there's different ways to get high. Some are not, some are self-damaging, and some are very healthy. And so drinking's fine, but drinking to excess is not such a great idea. Drug abuse, there's all these ways we think of getting high that are damaging, but I get high skiing. The thing I think I realize about skiing is when you're going down, at least me, when I'm going down the mountain, I don't have time to be worried about anything else. All those thoughts are removed. And so that for me is a big high. Exercise for me is a big high. Sam Young, who is our mutual friend, and I love the guy, he invited me to climb Kilimanjaro. So I started running for the first time in forever. And I started getting a runner's high. So there's all kinds of ways to get high, and not all of them are destructive. In fact, as human beings, we got to get high. We got to figure out our high that is healthy and constructive. There is healthy sex. There is healthy drugs that balance our emotions, that under the care of a doctor. There's all going out and having and drinking responsibility is a lot of fun for a lot of people. There's ways to get high without, causing misery. In fact, it's a good positive thing.
Yeah, because even some of the things that can be, so interesting how we typically think about drugs and alcohol, but even very like video games or work, scrapbooking, these can all become kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? So things are not healthy or unhealthy. It's how we use things, right?
Well said.
Or unhealthy. So I think that's, checking in with ourselves as far as, is this a way to just escape and zone myself out and dissociate, or is this a way to connect and have pleasure and have joy in my life, and it doesn't interfere with my relationships, right? Those are kind of some of the ways that maybe people can think about how we are using certain things in our life, because even exercise can become problematic for some people who are obsessed with exercise, things like that. Yeah. So okay, so then we're kind of moving into like stage 3, which is thriving. And to your point, maybe thriving isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea, that's not necessarily important to them. Maybe they get to survivor mode, and that's good. But for people who do want to kind of step into like that next step of thriving, you have some interesting thoughts. Like you have like faith, connection, forgiveness, resilience, and gratitude. I will say just off the bat that we could probably do a whole nother podcast just on forgiveness. I struggle with that word just because of how it's been used. I think it's just so weaponized, right? But I'd like to start with the faith. And you do a really good job of like explaining how we can get caught up in shaming each other for religious beliefs, right? Or non-religious beliefs as a human family, and the importance of allowing people their own spiritual journeys. So tell me a little bit about that and how you conceptualize.
Yeah. Well, faith is, out of the post-traumatic growth literature, they did the studies and they found that people that had faith, and that's expressed very broadly, and I want to touch on that, tend to statistically at least do better than those who are void in all respects spiritually. Faith can be, some of the folks I met at San Quentin are atheists, but their faith is in humanity and nature and things like that. And there's some of the best volunteers up there. They reach people that I can't. I guess my favorite chapter of scripture is Matthew 25, where it says Christ will judge all nations. That means Buddhists, Hindus, and everything. It has nothing to do with creeds or what you believe in or what ordinances you had or any of that. It's basically, were you helping those in need? Did you clothe the naked? Did you feed the hungry? Were you a kind-hearted person, or were you selfish? That's the divide. That's the dividing line, and it's right there. That's in my mind. I respect that as scripture. So that's how I've discarded a lot of these notions on faith. Meditation is huge. There's research that comes out from Sarah Lazar out of Harvard on the Buddhist practice of meditation. One of the nice things that I had, when I went through my faith crisis, I literally wiped the slate clean. I read Richard Dawkins. I went to India and met with the Buddhist and Hindu stuff. I did all of this, and I got to say, I learned something from everybody. I wasn't trying to find out who's right and who's wrong and black and white. My goal was to find what valuable messages everybody had and try and assimilate all of them into my new worldview. So meditation is something that is really lacking in Christianity, but that's very helpful. That if a lot of people find that very, very spiritual. So it's whatever works for anyone. I respect all points of view. I'm not trying to proselytize. I've given up on the whole proselytizing thing. I just know what works for me. But I know that I've seen the effects and the science out of meditation in particular being a very healthy path for spirituality.
Yeah, I love that. And that kind of goes back. I don't know that we ever really touched completely on grounding, which is a huge part of the first part of your book. So, which is basically go ahead.
Well, I gotta tell you, Natasha, you imagine this. The first time I ever meditated in my life, I sure didn't learn it at church or at school or anything. The first time I ever meditated, I'm in San Quentin prison holding hands with 2 convicted murderers. They taught me how to meditate. I loved it so much because my anxiety went down, my high blood pressure went down, and I kept doing it when I got home. And I would look forward to going back up to San Quentin so I could meditate with convicted criminals. It's really a magical practice.
Yeah, right. And like you say in the book, it doesn't take a lot of time. A lot of it is just focusing on breath. It's focusing in the present moment. Just so people know, there's tons of apps out there, Calm or Headspace, that will help you kind of figure out, how to get started. But yeah, 5 or 10 minutes a day can go a long way.
Yeah.
And the research isn't just about like, oh, do it when you're stressed. It's almost like exercise. Like if I want to go climb a hike, I could probably go do it. But if I'm not exercising, I'm going to have a much harder time climbing that hike than if I had been exercising on a regular basis. So having a daily ritual of meditation or grounding helps kind of that muscle, so that when you do face those, triggers or traumatic events, it helps you kind of already be ahead of the game. We got a question from one of our listeners, Alma, who asks, what is the probability of healing, surviving, and thriving if you are keeping yourself in the harmful environment?
It's tough. I don't recommend that. I sometimes people feel very trapped and it's very uncomfortable getting out of the trauma. There's all kinds of literature about trauma bonding. You probably know that topic better than me. But it's tough to heal from something where you haven't cleaned out the wound and sewn it up, to use kind of a surgical metaphor. If that wound is open and infected, we've got to treat it so that it can heal, and the scars eventually almost go away, or they add to our character. So I feel a lot of compassion for somebody asking that question, and say, please, make those uncomfortable steps to get out of harm's way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would totally agree with that. I think that obviously we're going to do better if we're not in those current environments. And there are steps that many of us can take to get into healthier spaces. But at the same time, like I was talking about earlier, there are spaces people can't necessarily escape. I think of minors, I think about all of our queer teens, who are not necessarily in a space where they can make their own decisions yet, and they may not have affirming family systems. And you even shared a really beautiful, I found myself crying when I was reading it, but the lady who you spoke with from the Holocaust, where she was in the camp and having to survive that, and how she came up with adaptive features, right? Like she would smile at her captors as a way to, not because, she knew what she was doing, she's being very strategic, but as a way to kind of have them not really notice her. And also this thing you talked about, how she was an artist. Well, in the camp, she would find coal and like little scraps of trash paper or something, and she would do intricate designs and art pieces, and these little tiny pieces of paper with just kind of pieces of coal. So it just speaks to, even when we are trapped or when we can't escape, the circumstances that we're in, we have such resilience that we can tap into.
Yeah, we can. And you're so right, Natasha. And I guess I would have to do more research into the situations where people are in trauma. They know they're in trauma, but like the example you gave of the queer teenager who's trapped in a family and community system that is not friendly to their situation. It should be that family and that culture is in the wrong. But what do you do? It's called survival for a reason, and you got to do what you got to do to survive, and not shoot yourself in the foot. And Erica Leon is a great example of your country is literally overrun with Nazis, and you're in a concentration camp. You kind of have to get into a survival mode with the hope and vision that one day you'll be out. If you read Man's Search for Happiness with Viktor Frankl, that's what he did. It was attitude and mindset where he envisioned, as he's trudging through the field to do manual labor all day, one day being at a podium explaining to academia what it was like being in that situation. So he actually had that worldview or that vision in his future, and that got him through the tough day, realizing that he was picking up lessons he would one day share. And he did, and created not just a best-selling book, but really enhanced a lot of lives because of the lessons he kept track of as he's going through his trauma. So I guess the bottom line is, envision that day where that trauma will be over, and make that a reality at some point.
Yeah, for sure. Which kind of goes into this part of thriving too, which is finding meaning in the suffering, finding gratitude, right? And this is tender. So I'm just gonna share some thoughts and then you can respond. But throughout the book, there's several times when you share this kind of theology or philosophy that everything happens for a reason. And I've had people come in with that on both sides of that sentence. There's people who really, really see that as a way to function, like they can make sense, even if I'm dealing with something hard or something unexpected, this thing that happened to me is happening for some reason. I think even you felt that way about your heart surgery, that it kind of helped you become the person you are. And then there's other people who will say, that's the most horrible thing ever, like this idea that everything happens for a reason. I was raped by my partner, or my child died, and I don't want to think that there was a a reason why I had to go through that, or especially if it's coming from God, like people who believe that maybe God is offering me this trial or this thing that I'm supposed to go to. Now I hate God, right? Because this is not something that I don't want to believe in things that would happen because, bad things would happen because I have to learn from it. So this is a really tricky kind of balancing act, I think, right? That for some people it's very, very helpful. For some people it kind of adds to their kind of traumatic feelings. Do you want to share any thoughts about all of that?
The last chapter of the book is on gratitude, and I'll never be grateful that I was born with a congenital heart defect and had open heart surgery. It was a mess. But I'll tell you this, today when I see a kid in a wheelchair, I mean, as a tall, white, straight guy who grew up Mormon in Orange County, California, I can tell you, I didn't develop a lot of empathy from that part of my life. But now today, I see a kid in a wheelchair, or I'm visiting somebody in the hospital and I walk past a room with a kid in the hospital bed, I tear up. I really feel it, because that was me. I don't have to imagine what that kid felt through. So am I grateful for my trauma? No, but I'm grateful for the tear. I'm grateful for the empathy. I'm grateful that I am a better, hopefully better, different and better person as a result of it. That's kind of the way I look at it. But the rape itself, or losing a child itself, or the medical problem itself, no, of course I'm not grateful for that. That's hideous. It's wrong. It should be called out for what it is. But be grateful for the lessons. One of the guys we interviewed was Ken Druck, who lost his daughter in a horrible accident. And he's now been on Oprah, I don't know how many times. He's helped millions process their trauma through his experience. Would he like his daughter back? Of course he would, in a second. But he's at least grateful that he's channeled that energy into something positive and productive and constructive rather than destructive.
Yeah, I think it's really the skill of having the both and, that to get away from either or thinking isn't in of itself a challenge. And so to be able to say, I mean, I've talked to so many people, for example, who survived cancer. I wouldn't wish cancer on my worst enemy. Mm-hmm. And, and I don't, again, I'm not glad I went through it. And boy, am I a different person because of that experience, right?
Yeah.
Look at the world, the way I don't take certain things for granted anymore, the way that I maybe have different relationships, people I got to meet, who knows what those things are. And so I think that is really important, is finding meaning, however you want to phrase it. If everything happens for a reason is not a phrase that works for you, that's fine. But find other phrases or other ways to make sense of your suffering, because suffering is part of life. I like that you talk about, is it the Buddha, right, who says life is suffering? And you're like, that's half of the equation, because life is also joy.
I got called up. I did an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, and I had just gotten back from my trip to India. And so I had a lot of Zen in me at the time, and I hopefully still do. And they asked me kind of that question of, how do you make meaning out of all the evil and horrific things? And, that is a Buddhist teaching, that life is suffering. And I think that you gotta own that in life. That's true. But there's the yin and the yang, and keep it both in mind and keep it in perspective. That's exactly what Erica Leon said. The same thing. Her heritage is, she's Jewish. She said the same thing. It's interesting how different world cultures kind of land on a lot of the same concepts, that being one of them.
A lot of universal truths, right? That was my favorite class at BYU, was world religions.
Oh, I never did that.
Yeah, I had an excellent professor who really brought that up, like, here's all these religions, all these cultures, and where are the pieces that they all agree on, and those are probably some universal truths. So that's
yeah.
That's yeah. I didn't like a lot of my other religious classes there, but yeah.
I think I was in those ones.
You were in those ones. Right. Okay. So yeah, we're right at about the hour. This has been such a great discussion. What am I not asking? What am I not kind of bringing up that you're like, oh, but I'd love to share this, or this would be a great final thought, or...
Well, Natasha, I always love talking to you. You have so much wisdom. I know you do a lot to help people. Life is, the old adage is it gets mundane, but it's so true. If life gives you lemons, you got to make lemonade. And life hits hard. I never thought that I would quit the Mormon church. I never thought I'd get divorced. I never thought that I've had other medical problems. I got COVID really bad. I got slammed with that, and I've been fighting my way for my health on that. I mean, and that's just me. I'm just one dude. But people all have these, frankly, shit shows that come their way. No one's immune from it. And it's really a matter of attitude. Are you gonna deal with it in a dignified, constructive way? And hopefully that's what this book is about. Not to but sugarcoating it is not the way to doing it. Being passive or passive aggressive or aggressive are all out. But being assertive, taking ownership and holding others responsible. That's kind of the worldview that I've ended up, and it seems to be working pretty great.
I love that. And I guess I'm going to ask a final question just about your optimism. At the very beginning, when you mentioned COVID, it reminds me, you said, "Well, I knew the situation was serious. I instinctively knew that most of us were going to survive. Even in those initial days, I was optimistic that despite all the fear mongering, we would emerge from the shutdown. The vast majority of humans on planet Earth are kind and caring people." You have seen a lot of shit. You have seen a lot of trauma. You've seen a lot of trauma. I mean, trauma is inflicted oftentimes by things we can't control, like the environment, tornadoes, hurricanes, et cetera. But a lot of trauma is inflicted by other people. How do you keep such an optimistic view of humankind?
I've had this unique career, and when I was working on the LA riots, of course, that was horrible. And you go into these disadvantaged neighborhoods, and I'll tell you, the vast majority of those people in those neighborhoods are kind, they're honest, they are economically disadvantaged, and they handle the whole situation with a lot of class and a lot of dignity. It seems like just a couple knuckleheads cause a lot of damage, but the vast majority of people are wonderful. You go to Hurricane Katrina, wiped out people. Well, you'd see families drive down from Kansas or wherever, and they had $800 in their bank account, and they loaded up their car with their blankets and food from their own pantry to find who they could give that $800 and their blankets to. When I went to the World Trade Center, I worked on that case. The destruction from these horrible, evil people that crashed planes in there, but you see the whole world coming out. You saw Buddhist monks praying in the streets. You saw people that would give their shirt off the back coming in, no matter how bad the situation. And I've seen the worst of the worst. I've worked on the worst of the worst. I've been there. There's always a far more overwhelming outpour of good, decent, caring people. Up in Utah, the encircle houses, I'm a little bit familiar with that. I realize there's a big problem there, but to see the love and the caring come out to help these kids who are being shunned by their own parents and their own community, that's awful. But the love that's coming out as a result is even more. I just see this phenomena over and over again, and that's why I'm optimistic. Yeah, it's a shitty world. Stuff happens to every one of us. None of us gets away, but the goodness that is always bigger. That's how I'm just calling it how I've seen it.
Yeah, well, and I would totally agree. I work in kind of trauma land every day, and yet we laugh, we cry, we get resilient, we work on relationships. People are amazing. We're amazing. We're amazing, resilient, adaptable creatures.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. All right. So tell us a little bit about, like, you mentioned a podcast that you're involved with. Where can people find you? Like, just throw out there for the audience what you're about, what you'd like to know people that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. My website is coreiq.com. Core IQ, the whole theme is our skills, life skills we all need that we're not taught in school. So, we're talking about trauma recovery. We do stuff on time management and goal setting and negotiation skills, all these kind of core IQ skills. And the podcast was called Post-Traumatic Thriving after the book, but we've shortened that to Core IQ. The books, you get book royalties, but the costs far outweigh them. You can buy the books, and I think I do that on purpose. The books are on, the Kindle versions are 99 cents. I'm not trying to monetize anybody's trauma or any of that. They're more of a passion that I have than a career in my situation. So the books are available on Amazon and everywhere else, and the Kindle versions are 99 cents. And if somebody can't afford one, and this has happened, email me and I'll send you one for free. But hopefully they cost some help. So, and I love the conversation. And Natasha, I know you're helping tons of people. I know speaking of shit, you've been through some, and you're one of the most fun, vibrant people you can hang out with. And I just want to say thanks for having me on, and thanks for all that you do to help our tribe.
Thank you, Randall. That's super nice. I can be a bit of a shit show myself and vibrant. And so I totally agree, and thank you for all the work you're doing. So I think everybody's doing their work, in some way or another. Like you say, there's so many people who will never be on a podcast necessarily, but that are just helping their neighbor or helping their own kids, or just we're all in this together. So
absolutely,
I think that's how we'll end. Thank you so much for this conversation. I hope you have a great rest of your summer, and let's connect this winter on skiing for sure.
Well, absolutely. Great seeing you. Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon halls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland